Young, alone and vulnerable, the child refugees who get to Europe and then vanish. Why are so many of what's being called the lost generation simply disappearing? You're watching Roundtable with me, David Foster. Who is looking out for them? Who, on the other hand, is taking advantage of them? According to the United Nations, nearly half of all refugees globally are children, and many have no one and nowhere to turn to.
Deadly wars have forced millions to flee their homes and make the dangerous journey to build a new life elsewhere. Children are often the most vulnerable victims of war. With so many orphaned or deprived of an education, is the world risking a lost generation? Protracted wars in places like Syria, Sudan and Afghanistan have caused a humanitarian crisis. Forced displacement hit a record 63.5 million in 2016, the highest in recorded human history.
It is really a hell on ground for the children. It is very difficult. There are bombardments, they are scared, they are seeing death and violence at a scale that you would hope no child would see.
The UN says half of the world's refugees are children, and many are making the journey alone, leaving them open to exploitation by people traffickers. In 2016, 26,000 child refugees arrived in Italy. 91% were said to be unaccompanied. 3/4 of 14 to 17-year-olds who arrived in Italy that year reported being held against their will or forced to work. And in 2015, 10,000 unaccompanied migrant children disappeared within hours of being registered in the EU. Only a handful have been found since. Others stayed in camps lacking sanitation, where they are reported to face the risk of sexual exploitation. With no end in sight for the wars displacing so many people, the child refugee crisis threatens to get worse. The migrant crisis is political dynamite in the EU. German Chancellor Angela Merkel accepted 1 million refugees in 2015.
Ich muss ganz ehrlich sagen, wenn wir jetzt anfangen, uns noch entschuldigen zu müssen dafür, dass wir in Notsituationen ein freundliches Gesicht zeigen, dann ist das nicht mein Land.
But there was a political price to pay. The far-right AfD made huge gains in German elections last year, running on an anti-migrant message. Other far-right parties have surged at elections across the EU, exploiting fears about mass migration. Hungary's Viktor Orban put up a fence along his country's border to stop migrants. And the closure of borders by some EU members has deprived thousands of unaccompanied children of safer and legal routes to asylum, leaving some minors as a target for traffickers or using illegal routes to reach their destination. Others are forced into child labour to pay their travel expenses. The crisis of child refugees cannot be ignored, but is a divided world collectively doing enough to solve the issue? Without proper protection, thousands of unaccompanied children will continue to risk exploitation and death.
Very pleased to say that joining us from Brighton we have Jo Wilding, who's investigated whether the UK government is protecting child asylum seekers. We have Zia Ahmed Eshanzada, part of TRT World's Am I Not a Child campaign. Matt Saltmarsh here too from the UN Refugee Agency, and Tess Berry-Hart from refugee aid and advocacy group Calais Action. Great to have you all with us. Zia, let's kick off first of all. I'm going to talk about your time as a refugee later, but let's kick off first of all with this campaign. What have you found out so far? What's it all about?
So Am I Not a Child campaign is TRT World Citizens' signature campaign this year to simply bring attention to the child refugees that are missing in Europe currently. So we are, this May 25th being the International Refugee Day, or rather International Missing Children's Day, we've launched this campaign, in particular this program, to bring about attention
Were you surprised by what you discovered looking into this?
The numbers are staggering,
yeah.
Really, 170,000 plus missing children, unaccompanied children rather, 10,000 of them missing altogether. The only reports we have that they've entered the EU, but they've vanished. We don't know what happened to them. So it's very surprising that in this day and age, in Europe, such thing could happen.
Where do they end up, do you think, Matt? I mean, I know you can't say specifically, but what are the real dangers facing those who just disappear?
Well, the children could end up anywhere, in reception centres, working in the black market, being
The reception
exploited.
centre is a good thing, because somebody's going to look after them, hopefully.
A good thing in comparison to the alternatives. They're not perfect by any means.
Yeah.
There's a lot of improvements that can be made to those reception centres, for sure, in Italy, in France, and in other countries.
But the black market as well, you know?
That's the real worry. The real worry is that children come in, smuggled in, or trafficked into the country, and then they are at the mercy of gangs and ripe for exploitation, if you like.
Are they deliberately separated in some cases from a responsible adult, or does it just happen because of the confusion?
It really depends. Over the route from Libya to Italy, nearly 92% of arriving refugees are minors, and sometimes they've been
What was that percentage again?
Something like 92,
Goodness gracious.
which is up from a couple of years ago, which was 75%, which was also not good. And sometimes they have been separated from family, yes. Other times they choose to make the journey by themselves, or their families pay smugglers. And very often they have pay-as-you-go schemes where the child, if the minor doesn't have enough money, then they are taken anyway, and then they get forced into slave labour along the route.
And presumably agencies such as yours, Matt, and your investigations, Joe, are aware of what happens to these children up to a certain point, and then they just disappear off the map.
Yeah, certainly what sometimes happens in the UK is that they're brought in, they claim asylum, and then they disappear. And it's often the case that they don't turn up again until, for example, they might be detained in a raid on a cannabis factory, or detained in a raid somewhere else where people are suspected of working illegally. So they've been brought in, somehow got into the system, and then they're taken out. Particularly, actually, with Vietnamese children, they're particularly likely to disappear and not reappear until these raids on cannabis factories.
I'm going to direct this one at Joe, but I mean, you may all have an opinion, so do just jump in. Have many more criminal enterprises sprung up as a result of this flow of migrants across Europe, or are they already practicing criminals who are taking advantage of this? Joe, first of all.
I couldn't tell you whether there's more criminal enterprises. All I can tell you is what happens to the young people that I've interviewed in my research, or the young people that I've represented in my work as a barrister. And it's often that they've been along the way, and as others have said, they've been picked off because they look vulnerable and exploited, particularly those with learning difficulties, particularly those who have run out of money and are having to earn their way across. So I couldn't tell you whether there's more criminal enterprises, but certainly those children are very vulnerable to being caught up in it. And it tends to be the little children are not travelling on their own. These are the teenagers that are more likely to be travelling on their own, the ones who are capable of kind of being forced into labour.
Yeah, and Zia, you were nodding, yeah?
Yes, yeah. I think we've done a number of documentaries about the organ
harvesting.
Yes, exactly. So this is a huge industry. This is for a lot of children. They happen to sell their organs, or a kidney in particular. You know, because they said, okay, you survive with one, so they have to give up one of their kidneys and other parts of bodies, because simply they don't have the kind of money to pay the smugglers and those who get them across to Europe.
So presumably somebody who persuades or forces a child to give up a kidney is operating outside the normal system. So there are health professionals who are facilitating this as well.
Exactly, precisely. So yeah, it's a real danger. This is just one of them. Of course, sexual exploitation.
Sex trafficking as well. There was a Save the Children report that said there was a staggeringly high proportion of minors arriving who had reported sexual abuse, sexual crimes or activities that could have been linked to exploitation. And as with any of these cases, when you have a large, unregulated, undocumented flow of very young people without proper protections, they will always be subject to criminal gangs. So it would not surprise me if criminal activity had flourished around the refugee crisis.
Why are we not getting these children as they arrive in Europe? Is it because the system's letting them down, or they're bypassing the system?
It's a very complicated situation. I mean, one point is that we track the arrivals of those children who come by sea, so particularly into Italy, which is the largest port of arrival. But those coming by land, and to a much lesser extent by air, are not monitored and not tracked. And even those ones who come in by sea to the ports, to Italy and Spain, and to a lesser extent Greece, quite often they will move on from their initial port of disembarkation. And there isn't a system, a Europe-wide system, in place for monitoring these minors on each step of their journey.
So they are supposed to apply for asylum if they want it in the country in which they first land, correct?
That's correct, although we do have the Dublin regulation, which also allows children to apply for asylum in a different European country if they have
family.
Correct. Yeah.
And the problem with the Dublin regulation is that after Brexit, these protections of refugee family reunion may be in doubt because the EU withdrawal bill, which is going to be soon voted on, has an amendment by Lord Dubs, which is to safeguard the
Dubs amendment.
That's right. Well, it's Dubs 2, technically speaking.
So tell me, this is a guy called Alf Dubs himself, once time a refugee.
That's right.
Yep. Who decided it would be the right thing to do to say, get the UK government to agree to take in 3,000 plus refugee children, I think it was. Only 300, I think, have been allowed to come in.
And the scheme itself
So where
has
has
been
it gone wrong?
Well, I think a lot of it is to do with the hostile environment that has been growing up in recent years. There's also a culture of disbelief towards those children seeking asylum. And
so that doesn't explain why the government has stopped bringing these people in. It may explain why they get a bad reception when they get here.
Well, the Home Office doesn't want to bring in more child refugees because there is such an outcry about immigration, and there is a conflation of the ideas of illegal immigration and child refugees. So there is no impetus for the Home Office to want to bring in child refugees, which is why Alf Dubs, himself a Labour peer and a former child refugee, tabled the first Dubs amendment in order to help those children without family in the UK. And this Dubs 2 regulation is to preserve the right to family reunion after Brexit for those with family here.
Is it that governments don't really want to pay much attention to this and they're quite happy to let it disappear? We're not just talking about the UK, we're talking about across Europe.
I think it's a very, very complicated situation, and I think there have been improvements in terms of reception, in terms of identification, in terms of tracking of children, but still we're a long, long way from this being a well-regulated sort of setup. So yes, a lot more could and should have been done, I think, by government.
Zia, I'm going to ask Joe something very quickly, if I may, and then come back to
I'd like to chime in that as well.
Yeah, of course. But Joe, we're talking about one particular government and whether it has fulfilled its moral and legal obligations. But do you get a sense that other people are just really hoping that this will just disappear?
I think so. I think all of the governments in Europe, on the whole, have just hoped the problem would go away with minimal action from them and that it would kind of be someone else's problem. So there's a real reluctance to kind of step up and take in children or refugees as a whole. And with the Dubs amendment, there was a lot of talk about, well, if we start letting children in, if we start letting them apply for refugee family reunion, that will operate as a pull factor and it will pull more people in, more people will set off. And I think there's a real problem with that attitude, that if you ignore the problem, it will somehow go away. If you don't rescue people who are drowning in the Mediterranean, then they won't come anymore. That's not how it works. People are coming because they're desperate. And, you know, when you talked earlier about this idea that they should claim asylum in the first safe country they come to. Well, first of all, they mostly don't know that. But secondly, if you arrive in Italy and the first thing you face is destitution and a lack of any kind of proper reception, that doesn't feel like you've arrived in a safe country from the point of view of the young person who's a refugee. And so they carry on traveling and they're still at the mercy of traffickers or smugglers or criminal gangs that want to exploit them, or absolutely anyone. And that's why they go missing along the way, because there is nothing there in the places where they first arrive to say, okay, we need to get you somewhere safe, we need to protect you. And the very little children might get picked off and protected.
Yeah. I know you want to say something, but can anybody answer this question? Are we seeing any really successful prosecutions or investigations into who is responsible for this? And I know there's a mirror. You're shaking your head, Joe.
No. I mean, I've been involved in trafficking cases as a barrister where I've represented someone and they've said, this is what's happened to me. And you get the Home Office saying, we don't believe you, or even we do believe you, but there's nothing further. There's no then kind of passing on of that information on the whole to police or to the UK Human Trafficking Centre. So it sort of stops there. So when I had trafficking victims as clients who said, well, it was this family that I was trafficked by, or it was this man who exploited me. There's nothing further. There's often, as somebody referred to this culture of disbelief, there's often a dispute over whether they're telling the truth, but there's no actual investigation. It goes no further than that.
Zia, many years ago during the Soviet war in Afghanistan, your family was forced to leave. You became refugees, you lived in Pakistan and eventually ended up in the United States.
Correct.
Did you ever feel at any point that the system took care of you, or did you have to fend for yourself?
Unfortunately, never. The system, I didn't think there was a system in Pakistan in particular to take care of us. And the aids that came to refugees from the Western countries never reached, or seldom reached the refugees that were meant to be, because there were so many filtration, there's so many bureaucracy that they never made to the refugees. I myself, like for example, was mentioned earlier, we were forced. My father had a very good position with the government, but when your life is in danger, you don't really care about all that stuff. So you move, and a very difficult circumstances with the Soviet regime being in charge.
People got lost in the system or just disappeared?
Yeah, definitely, yes, definitely. I have distant cousins that they've completely disappeared, and we don't know their whereabouts. It could be ending anywhere.
Look, I'm not putting you too much on the spot here, but the name of your organisation is the High Commission for Refugees. Yeah, is the UN letting these people down?
As an organisation, we're doing what we can. We have human rights law, we have the Refugee Convention, we have the Convention on the Rights of the Children, we have European acquis, we have laws in place. We're an organisation of 15,000 people working around the world in crises from Africa to Central America to Bangladesh, Syria and beyond. There is a lot of dedicated professionals who are out there in the field doing what they can. We can't do this alone, or even with our...
Let me quickly get to this one. We were talking there about 170,000, of which 10,000...
Undocumented,
undocumented, go missing. Add to that those who are documented. How many people would you have helping to sort that situation out?
Well, we're actually...
We're talking hundreds of thousands.
In Europe, we're a relatively small player. I don't know how many we have in the field in
20,
Europe.
50, 100?
Exactly. We would have thousands.
Okay, but relatively small.
But our resources will tend to be in major refugee situations in the world. For example, the Syria situation, Jordan, Turkey, Lebanon, Bangladesh at the moment, in Africa, the Great Lakes region, and so on.
So you can't protect these children?
We have to work with governments and partners on the ground to do the best that we can to try and protect these children. But in terms of actually tracking and tracing these children, we don't have the ability to do that. That has to come from governments and governments working together.
So straight up, you cannot protect them? I know you do the best you can
to protect them.
Give us an honest answer. You can't, can you?
We can't protect children when we don't know where they are, when they've gone missing. We can't do that, no.
Is there a way of changing this?
Well, to consolidate safe and legal routes to asylum, such as preserving the Dublin Regulation on Family Reunion, reopening the DUB scheme and expanding existing transfer resettlement schemes, not only from Europe, but also from countries of origin, because that will help dissuade children from making that perilous journey to Europe in the first place.
I wasn't trying to be unkind to May.
No, absolutely.
I was simply saying that it is an impossible problem, isn't it?
Well, it's impossible when you see the sheer weight and the staggering numbers. But then you look at what Britain is doing, which is taking less than 1% of refugees worldwide, and you think, well, we can do better.
We're talking missing children particularly.
Yeah, but without those routes to asylum, that's why they go missing. They don't have faith in the system. They trust their lives to traffickers or train tracks because they have that no other option.
Yeah, and we'll talk about Calais, which is, you've got Calais Action Group in just a moment, because a lot of people might think that's already over since the jungle, as it was known, has shut down. I just want to bring in Jo, because she's sort of nodding in agreement, or she wants to say something anyway.
No, I think that's absolutely right. The key to this all is, of course, one organisation can't protect them all. Of course, the UN High Commission for Refugees can't protect all of those children. It has to come from the governments of Europe when the children arrive, and they need to step up and as has just been said, provide those safe and legal routes, not only for children, but for people who are fleeing conflict. They can't all stay in Lebanon. They can't all live in Libya and be at risk of those slave markets that we've all seen. So the governments of Europe do need to step up and do need to say, we will take in these children, we will accommodate them. It needs to be cascaded down all the way from national government to local government.
Germany's been a good example of what could be done.
It has, and I believe that Portugal offered to take in refugees. I'm not exactly sure what happened about that. But yes, we do actually need to recognise that there are these conflicts around the world that often have not been helped by Britain's actions, to be frank, and by Britain's role in the arms trade and so on. And we must actually step up and take our share of responsibility.
Zia, you want to jump in? I want to ask you a question at the end of that.
Sure. I was just going to say, we have to find out why are they leaving after they're being registered, coming to a camp or whatever. They're registered. Why are they leaving? And one of the reasons the conditions are so bad for children that they have to flee. One of the main reasons that they leave.
You're talking about their country of origin?
No, when they come to, let's say,
that was alluded to, wasn't it? You arrive in Italy thinking you've reached
Europe,
promised land.
Yeah, precisely. But they're gone, and that's one of the reasons. That's why I think more than the UN, I think we need the host countries, policymakers to make a stricter and provide a better system for them to be tracked, to be welcomed, to feel safer. They don't feel any safer after fleeing their homelands, being in a war zone, and they come to Europe and they find it to be worse, in a worse condition. So that is the issue. I think one of the main issues, the core problem is that because they're not happy and the conditions are so bad that they take matters in their own hands and they flee, and they just, one of the reasons they're missing.
Let's bang TRT World's drum on this one, because this is Am I Not a Child is the project.
Precisely.
Hope after a particular amount of exposure that we draw attention to it. But I suppose the reason why you have to do it is partly because, yes, it was headline news 2 years ago, and now it's today's fish and chip paper.
Absolutely right. I mean, with the peak in crossings of Syrians in 2015, when over 1 million made the journey across the Mediterranean, there has been a decline in numbers, but also then a decline in attention on the refugee issue. The media aren't reporting it as they were a couple of years back. And of course, the problem is still there, the situation is there. The numbers in the Syria situation have actually increased, the numbers of refugees, and you just have to look at the news to see that conflict is still rife.
Where are they going? How are they getting into Europe?
Well, many of them are remaining in the region. Some of them are crossing, and then we have new routes through the Mediterranean, not so much of Syrians, but of sub-Saharan Africans. And this is the route through which so many of the unaccompanied children are actually going on, which is very worrying, because on that route, making that journey, you can imagine the potential for exploitation. You have to put your life into the arms of an adult.
Thousands of miles.
Absolutely.
Every one of these adults has a reason to do it, and a lot of it's just profit, isn't it?
That's right.
So do we just have to keep banging on about it? Do you think things will change?
Well, nothing changes if you don't keep banging on about it. But I also think that there's compassion fatigue in a way. I alluded to the hostile environment earlier. I think since Brexit, the idea of people coming to this country has been coloured somewhat. So I think that the only thing that we can do is to keep using the tools that we have, which is legislation in Parliament, which is expanding resettlement schemes, and keeping the issue fresh and new.
And don't think just because you can't see the jungle anymore that the problem's gone away in a lot of
Absolutely not. Well, the jungle that was demolished 2 years ago was only the latest incarnation of many jungles which have been happening since, the last 30 years or so. So there are still many thousands of people living in hedges. I met a 15 and a 16-year-old Eritrean girls living in a hedge. At least while the jungle was there, there was a focal point, there were support systems, there were grassroots groups that could go and help them. And now it's just a wilderness.
Okay, thank you. We all know how easy it is to get lost in the jungle, isn't it? Thank you all very much indeed. I'm sorry, that's the end of our programme. Okay. The campaign continues.
Exactly.
Am I not a child? That's a reasonable question to ask if you happen to be vulnerable, particularly if you happen to be alone. Treated with respect, treated with dignity. It isn't always happening. Thank you to all of my guests for coming on this programme. World Child Day, is that what it's called?
International Missing Children's Day.
Missing Children's Day.
May 25th.
May 25th. Thank you for watching this edition of Roundtable. If it's stirred your conscience, made you think a little bit more about it, and if something positive can come out of this, I'm glad. I'm David Foster from my guests and from the Roundtable team. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.